And with that, I'm super excited to introduce our first guest of the night, Chris Roberts, who is currently, smiling there, ready to go, serving as the VCISO or VCISO. Is that the way to say that, Chris?
Virtual CISO, yeah.
Right?
It's when you basically divide yourself up and sell yourself to different companies. It pays the bills.
So I'm going to read a couple more things. I'm hacker, InfoSec, safety, cyber stuff researcher, advertiser at Hack Not Crime, henchman, and various other names on the technical side of the world. The executive consultant leadership and other words that have been leveled against him, describing some of the other work undertaken over the years. And he's been fortunate enough to be elbow deep in technology for more years than he cares to remember. And these days is involved in both tactical and strategic discussions with clients across the spectrum and industries, talking maturity, risk, and how to affect change. He also recently got called a Scottish security warlock. He's digging that, and he's obviously happy to connect, talk, and discuss what we can all do to affect change in the world, to collaborate and communicate in a way that benefits us all. And he has some other things here about the hooded matrix thing. All right, yeah. So, and worst case, to jog the memory, he was a researcher who at one point gained global attention in 2015 for demonstrating the linkage between various aviation systems, both on the ground and while on the air or in the air, that allowed the exploitation of attacks against flight control systems. I will let you guys Google about that later. I'm sure some of you have already heard about it, and I would ask that my assistants check to make sure there's nobody still in a waiting room at this point. And with that, I'm going to enjoy the ride and let Chris kind of take over for the night. And then I will ask my students when they're ready, if they've got some questions, to go for that as well.
How do you want to do the questions? Do they want to put them in the Zoom group chat, or?
I think that would probably be the best way.
Yeah.
And if they, they've got the docs as well, so we can go from there.
Okay. Yeah, by all means, if they want to put the questions in the Zoom chat, I have the Zoom chat up at the moment. Perfect. So I'm more than happy. I'm keeping an eye on it. I already said good evening to everybody. So I'm following along the interpreter. It's actually really, really cool. My sign language is rusty, to say the very least, but it's actually really nice to see it. All right, so what do we want to talk about? What do we want to go through? We can go through the industry. We can have a talk about getting into the industry. We can definitely talk about some of the changes that we need to see in the industry. We can have a conversation about why the industry is in the mess that it's in at the moment by far and away. So there's all sorts of things. I'm just seeing if anybody's going to chuck a question out there, or if we want to have a little bit of fun. I was actually going to do gallery view and see what we have.
I was going to say, they're all so shy.
Come on, stop being shy. That is actually, it's one of those interesting things in this industry. You know, we talk about people being shy and people not wanting to ask questions. And, oh, there we go. We got some questions.
Here they come.
Yeah, we'll have a good one. Yeah. One of the really interesting things in the industry is people don't necessarily like asking questions. I see it so often, not just at conferences, but as organizations. You know, we see it when we see companies, you know, they're like, hey, we need to buy some new technology, or we need to learn about what this thing called artificial intelligence is. And yet they don't arm themselves with all the right questions. All right, so saying that, I'm actually going to hit the questions that we see here. So the first one's from, do I want to say names? Do we want to get people out there? Yeah, we'll see. Chris Burns or Christopher. The biggest threat for business. I think there's a couple of things, and it's not just one thing. The biggest one is simply just awareness. We see it so often. Perfect example, the last week and a half, a number of us have been dealing with the recent uplift in attacks on healthcare. And a lot of it is, you know, you'd think that healthcare would understand by now that they're a target, that they have information, that they have all this data. But unfortunately, so often is the case, they're so focused on keeping patients alive, on making sure that they do everything they need to do in the physical world, that they tend to ignore the digital world so much. And unfortunately, the time that they find out that they've got a problem is normally the time when the computer's been ransomware. So I think one of the biggest threats in the industry is simply awareness, is actually understanding what the risks are in the security industry, how they can do some very, very simple basic things about it, and who they can turn to. You know, part of our problem in the industry is we have so many companies that are out there saying that they have a solution, or that they can fix all the problems, or that they're 100% safe, that it pollutes the air. We can't make sense of it. And so the companies that are looking for some solutions or some help just don't know the right places to turn. So I think, you know, we look at the simple stuff. The biggest threats in the businesses in the industry is the simple stuff. It's companies that still have all their defaults in place, companies that don't protect the data, that don't even maybe know where all that data is, companies that don't necessarily understand what their risks might be. They don't realize that having remote desktop protocol on the internet is a bad thing. Or why shouldn't I do that? I need people to get in and all these other things. So there's some very, very simple risks. Then part of it comes down to manpower, is how do I get the right resources in to fix some of the problems? And again, we're looking at small to medium businesses here. I think, again, you look at the focus, so many of the small to medium businesses are getting hit that it's crazy at the moment. So a lot of it is, how can you help the small to medium businesses focus? How could you volunteer time? How can you help them get more awareness? And so a lot of areas there.
So just to jump in on that, Chris, just a quick, you know, how many, I guess, and this is kind of my initiative with the College of Business, right? I mean, we're looking at it from, it is a risk management thing. However, we really don't teach it from the business school many times, right? As a thing to be aware of. It's always a bolt on, or, you know, the IT guys or the cybersecurity guys.
Yeah.
And is there a need for that shift? You know, more awareness even at the business schools?
Absolutely. Absolutely. I mean, when you teach business, so if you're in a business school and you teach business, you teach financial risk, accounting risks, you teach manufacturing risks, you teach risk in the markets, supply chain. And so you teach all of these things. And as we've seen in the last few years, more and more and more businesses are obviously relying on the internet for everything from communication to collaboration to supply chain, to data, to storage, and everything else in between it. And yet we don't teach people how to understand those risks. Now, conversely, in the security space, we haven't been good at talking about risk in a business sense. We always come and go, you know, we have the biggest risks and we have the biggest problems and you must listen to us. But that's not true. You know, what we have to do is come to the table and go, look, we have risk, but so does finance, and so does legal and HR and everybody else. How can we all measure those risks effectively and understand what to do with them? That's huge and it's critical, and it's going to take both us and the business people to understand that. So, you know, when we talk about the biggest risks, part of it is understanding and awareness, but part of it is then, what do I do with it? How, now I understand it, great, you've just told me that all of my data is going to get stolen. What the hell do I do about it? Who do I turn to? And what are some simple things that I could do? So training, that's part of the reason I've tied in with the folks over at Wiser. So Gabrielle and the Wiser training team, it's part of the reason I've turned up and working with them, is because they do a whole bunch of free training and a whole bunch of free awareness. And it's, you can go out there, they're really short videos, 30, 60, 90-second videos, pardon me, that you can go out and you can learn and understand what some of the risks are. All right, I'm going to hit the second one. What makes me say the industry is in a mess? So, let's get on the soapbox on this one. We, this year, are projected to spend over 120 billion US dollars in our industry. As it stands at the moment, the average amount of time it takes a company to discover that they have been breached is around about 200 days. It actually varies between 80 days and over 1,000 days. Once you've discovered that the large hairy thing is running around your network, it then takes you over 2 months to get rid of me. Also, we are losing globally over 22 million records every single day. And that's credit cards, social security, healthcare information, financial information, personal information. We're losing it. So when you add that and a whole bunch more statistics, you've got to look and go, we're spending all this money and we can't protect what we're doing. We failed. And we failed because we're not inclusive, we're not diverse, and we think that we're the special snowflakes. We haven't sat down effectively with the development teams and learned from them and helped them in how to understand our world. We haven't sat down with operations and learned from them and helped them understand our world and obviously their world. So we haven't done enough to actually make risk and make security core to a lot of organizations. So that's part of it. Part of it is also we've ignored people. We have gone chasing down the world of technology. We have ignored processes. We have ignored procedures. We have ignored controls. And we have basically laid at the altar of technology going, it'll fix everything for us. Guess what? It hasn't. It's failed. And so we, again, have to take a step back and go, how do we focus on the people? Rather than blaming the user for all the problems and saying they are the weakest link and we can't educate them, and I've done that, we need to take a step back and go, how do we enable them? How do we make them the most effective tool that we have? How do we help them look after themselves and their families and the company that they work for? We have a lot of work to do. I mean, how often, too often, I've gone into companies where we've gone, okay, show me your incident response plan. And they're like, we were working on one of those. And, all the computers are in the middle of a ransomware attack. And so, and it's simple. These are simple things that haven't been done. So again, the problem from our industry is we promise so much and we deliver so little, especially for the amount of money that we spend. So that, in a very, very short nutshell, is why I see we have such a problem in our industry. Okay, so
just add to that a little bit.
Yeah, totally.
From a systems thinking, right? Systems thinking approach, right? It's people, processes, and technology. And we talk a lot about all the money we spend on little blinky lights versus, right, all the people and processes and protection of those. So good tie-in. I appreciate this. I did want to mention that one of the students that joined is one of the guys that actually asked to bring in all of you guys for this webinar series. So he did make it tonight, and I'm glad to see. Jared, if you'd get a chance, put your questions in the chat tonight. Okay.
Awesome. Kudos to Jared. Definitely kick ass. Yeah. I think. I mean, the other part of this one as well. So a perfect example. Let's face it, this country is going through an election, if you hadn't noticed. So we have the technology with the election systems. There are three main companies that have built election software and hardware. For the last 4 years, 3 or 4 years, in our industry, officially, we've been beating up on that technology. Now, outside of the official stuff, we've been hacking the election system since 2000. Officially, we've had the DEF CON Voting Village for the last several years. It has put a report out about the state of the election systems. Nothing has changed. We haven't changed the election hardware. We haven't changed the software that runs it. We haven't changed the architecture that runs it. And we're still using Everest and 1234 as the core passwords for securing democracy. We've failed somewhere.
Gosh.
This
is going to come up too. And I appreciate you just alluding to all of the research and work that's being done, because this was going to be a question, obviously, given the currency. So thanks.
Oh my gosh, there's a ton of work that's been done in that world. I mean, like an absolute ton of work. And I think a lot of it is there's a misconception. So a lot of us on the research side want to see a difference. I think the biggest frustration from a researcher is I don't just want to break something. I want to give you some solutions. I want to show you how you can make it better. I want to help you understand. I want to give you options. aviation systems was a perfect example. I mean, we started researching those in 2009, 2010. We were sitting in some very, very senior people's offices in 2013 and 2014, and we were literally told nothing's going to change. The idea was until more people die, until more people basically end up in planes that plow into the side of a hill, nothing changes. And that was demonstrated obviously several years later when Boeing lost 2 airplanes, the 737 Maxes, and it took, you know, what, 300-400 people to die before Boeing was like, maybe we should fix that problem. And so that was always our question was, okay, we do all this research, we give you options to fix it, but until we kill more people, you're going to do nothing about it. And as a researcher, that doesn't sit well, which is why we published the research. And, you know, we got yelled at, as did a bunch of others. And now they're making changes, but it takes so long sometimes. I mean, that's why I love the bug bounty programs. You know, some of them are great, some of them are not so good. You know, huge shout out to like HackOne and Casey over at BugCrowd for the work that they've done. And, you know, I'll call out Tesla. Tesla as well, for years, has come to the table. Same thing with GM. GM and Tesla have come to the table, have literally put cars there and said, tell us what's wrong with them, and offered us money and, you know, had some fun with it. So I love that interaction, and it works really well from a researcher because we get to see those results. But with the election systems, you know, we put all this data in and it just disappears into a black hole. And, you know, again, until we change democracy so that I can vote in like John McAfee, or I can vote in, you know, I don't know who the hell I'd vote in. I'd vote somebody in, you know, and until I can vote those people in and go, hey, I prove a point, at which point then I get yelled at. So 6 of one, half dozen the other. All right, let's have a look. We got, all right, Ian. Ian's put a really, really good question out, which is, we learn a lot of theory about how the frameworks to deal with cyber threats, but how well or poorly are they implemented? So if we let's take a couple of the main frameworks. Let's take NIST and let's take ISO, the 2 good ones. I mean, there's COVID, there's a bunch of others. There's a lot of work in the industry to put in frameworks where companies are aware. Hey, buddy, you want to come here and get a snack? This is one of my wolf mutts. Welcome to Milo. Come here.
There you go.
Yeah, totally. I'll give him a snack. Otherwise I end up getting, so this is Milo. He is my 2.5-year-old Great Dane. He weighs about 190 pounds, give or take a little bit. Yeah, he's awesome. He's my baby. So again, okay, so let's talk about frameworks. If we look at NIST, get out of my chocolates. If we look at NIST is actually a really, really good framework. The 853 series, especially the new version, the revision 5, is a really good framework to grow towards and to build towards. What I like about it is you have a maturity scale. So you can go in and go, this is where I am, and this is where I want to be, this is where I need to be, this is where I have to be, and you can build towards it. You can put a plan in place, you can hit all these different things. Downside is it's very complicated. I took the NIST framework and I built a 1-page spreadsheet that has like 40 questions and 11 responses, and that's it. So I built my own version that I use to measure a lot of the companies that I work with. And that makes life easier. And the same thing ISO, but there are a lot of companies who are doing something, and they have to. You know, if you have PCI or you have HIPAA, HITRUST, FERC, NERC, or any of the other regulatory things, you have to put a framework in place. But there are so many companies that don't. Again, back to the small to medium business companies, they have no clue. There's no way a company of 50 or 100 people is ever going to want to or be able to put in an 853 framework. So we need to do something simpler. We need to build the top 10 security controls, the top 10 things you can do to protect yourself. You know, this is where you get into, you know, detection, which is where you get into awareness, which is where you get into data and all sorts of other things. So I think there's room for improvement for those small to medium businesses and the supply chain. But there's they're good frameworks, and when you can put them in and when you can help companies understand them, then I think they're amazing. But it takes a lot of work.
What's the appetite for the CSF, right? The cybersecurity framework, and using that for the small medium. I know we cover that a lot because, you know, we look at it as we've even actually kind of charted out a profile development tool for small and medium businesses. In a sense, take that 102 of the subcategories and make it something digestible, but also add a maturity level to it. And I know I've run some projects with students doing that in the past.
Yeah, I think it's fantastic. I hadn't forgotten about it. I always, unfortunately, I always have to do the big scary one.
Yep.
But the
cybersecurity framework. Yep.
What are you doing, you doofus? The cybersecurity framework is actually fantastic. I like it a lot. And again, I think you're right. You can build a lot of simplicity into it. The other one I like, and I'll give a shout out to a very good friend of mine. So we do on Thursday nights, we do the security shit show, and it's every Thursday night. We do it at 9 o'clock Mountain Time, so 11 o'clock Eastern Time at night. One of the guys on it is Ryan Cloutier. So he and Evan run Security Studio. And that's great because it takes those frameworks and it gives you a score. It simplifies them and gives you something you can relate to. And that score is the same thing that we know as humans from our credit score. So it's the same idea. Low score, what can I do to make it better? How can I make it simpler? How can I make it easier? I have a lot of time for those. I think they're great, but I do still think we could make them a little easier, a little simpler. The cybersecurity framework, I want to say statistics were like in the medium-sized businesses, there's like about 40 or 50% of companies had looked into it or were doing something with it.
Yep.
So that's really, really, really encouraging.
We know that our
Europe,
university
you get a lot more ISO. Yeah.
Sorry,
and there's
our university uses it.
Nice.
With the audit office as well. So there's kind of a connection with that in COVID. They try and tie them in together. So very good.
Well, okay, so there you hit another point on the head as well, which is security is not always our responsibility.
Right.
This is where this is it's not an us versus them thing. It can't be. It used to be, but it can't be anymore. It has to be, hey, security now, let's bring HR to the table. Let's bring audit and compliance to the table. Let's bring finance to the table and go, look, if legal doesn't do its part, we have problems here, supply chain. If audit doesn't do its part, we won't understand what the problems are. We have to listen to the audit team as opposed to, as opposed to make them out to be the bad people. And by the way, finance, if we screw up, here are the potential implications and the potential issues that we will face. And so you come to the table, to leadership's office and to the board and go, here is what we would like to do. Not here's what security wants to do. Here's how we would like to protect and reduce the risk of the company more effectively.
Or in our case, again, the university has 5 international campuses. So it's not just the we here in Rochester, right? It's Dubai, it's Croatia, it's, go on and on. And so we have, international implications as well.
Huge. And I think, again, that's where we can use that to our advantage, because we can have the conversations about GDPR, and we can have the conversations about the Middle Eastern initiatives and all of these discussions where we talk about, individual protection. How do I look after the very people that I'm responsible for? And again, one of those biggest issues of why security is in such a mess is we go after the money. We're charging after the money. That's it. How much money can I make? How quickly can I sell my company? How many people can I convince to buy my product? Rather than taking a step back and go, how do I take care of the people I'm responsible for? How do I look after the charges that are relying on me to do my part of my job? Yes, it's everybody's job. The person that is sitting between the keyboard and the chair has to be responsible and click responsibly and learn and listen But we've got to do our part by educating them. We've got to do our part by training them, by empowering them. And it's things like that where we have to step up more effectively.
And so from my background, and probably yours as well, it's a team effort. And as a team leader, if you will, right, you know that we make sure that all of our team members are trained.
Totally.
And so,
Oh,
yeah,
absolutely.
and I think we missed that. We missed that. Yeah, thank you.
No, totally. So I'm going to hit, oh, wow, there's some really good questions. I love these ones. All right, I'm going to try and I'll work through some more of these. Let's hit Finbuzz. How do you get people to take the risk seriously? And in an instance that you are trying to sell, how do you convey value? So getting people to take risk seriously is a conversation. And it actually ties into another conversation that's on here about how do you get people to value their security. The easiest way, unfortunately, is after something has happened. I lost my data got stolen, my data's been breached. Oh shit, now what do I do? That's easiest way. And unfortunately, in a lot of cases, that's the only way people find out. Take a step back and let's all look at our childhood. When you were first introduced to the kitchen as a child by your parent or by your guardian, it was here is the kettle or here is the stove. Don't touch it because it's hot. What did we all do? We reached out and we touched the damn thing. And we learned through experience. That's great in an analog world. It's the same thing. You know, you learn how to cross the road properly, or you end up getting run over. It's really simple. You either become safe or you become a Darwin Award. And in the analog world, that's easy. The implications and the repercussions are immediate. You get burned, you get run over, you end up in hospital, whatever it might be. In the digital world, it's not so immediate. If I steal your identity, you don't immediately feel pain. What happens is I make another credit card, I make a passport for you, I go buy drugs on your behalf, and over time, you understand the implications of what's happened. So there's no good tactile feedback. So we have to figure out a better way of helping people understand to put a passcode on the telephone. We have to help people understand why I can use your information against somebody else. And by the way, you will take the blame for it. We have to help people understand why Google Alexa, however wonderful it is to be able to yell at Alexa and order something, means that means I, as the attacker, now have access to all of your system. I think fundamentally it comes down to this, and I've used this example a couple of times. So I keep weapons in the lab. We look at this and we go, this is a really, really cool thing. It's a mobile telephone. It's amazing. It's wonderful. It allows me access to everything. We don't look at it in the same way that we look at one of these. If you ask a simple question to anybody on this planet and go, which one is more dangerous? Most people will say this, unless you work in our world, at which point they'll say this. And so our job is to try to help people understand that that gun is actually less dangerous than this device. I can kill somebody across the planet with this. With that thing, I can only kill somebody 200 yards. And I can only get 9 shots out of that. With this, I can take a hospital down and kill way more people. And we have to explain it to people in a very real world scenario, not fear, uncertainty, and doubt, and not, the end of the world scenarios, but very much a case of like, look, here's why you use a passcode. Here's why you don't click on everything. Here's the pieces of information that you own that other people will want to use against you. Again, I'll shout out to Wiser. If anything, go out to the Wiser training. Go look at the compendium that we've put together. It's a dictionary that talks about geek to English. Go look at the training. It's free. A ton of it's free. I mean, you can pay for the additional stuff, but a ton of it's free. And that helps people understand why passwords are useful, why passcodes on phones are useful. I mean, we've done a ton of work on this to really get people to think. because it's, again, I hate to say it, it's like COVID. It's like the whole problem that we have with people wearing masks. If you are an able-bodied human being and you can wear a mask, then wear one of the fucking things, because it's not about you. It's about everybody around you. If I lose my information, all of my clients lose their information. The people that work for me lose their information. My family loses its information. And it's the same thing. If you don't put a passcode on this telephone, I can not only get to you, I can get to your kids, I can get to your family, I can get to your bank account, I can sell you medical data, I can use your phone to host child pornography on, which then gets you in trouble and everybody else benefits. It's simple things like this, very simple, very real world examples that we need to try to help people understand. And there's ways of doing it. Again, look at the stuff we've done in the training and the awareness programs. We did some simple things. I think I did them when I came up to RIT a couple of years ago. I bought some of the Bluetooth, the Ubertooth phone things with us. And very quickly, I can sit here in the audience and I can get into 8, 10 other people's phones. And I can listen in on conversations and I can put things on people's phones. We see it with privacy. When Apple came out with the AirPhone, there was the AirDrop. You could drop images onto other people's telephones. I could walk through an airport with thousands of other people and automatically just put things on their telephones. I could be nice, or I could be an absolute asshole about it. And so it's simple things like this that we need to help people understand. All right, what do we got next? Let's have a look. I'm actually going to hit this one. What's the biggest recommendation you have for someone interested in entering the cybersecurity field? Ooh, I like that one. That's a good one. All right. Couple of things. Firstly, get involved. There are conferences, there is B-sides, there is the stuff that we're putting on here. There's LinkedIn, there's all these other places that you can get involved, both online while we're still locked down, and also when we eventually are allowed out in society again. There's all the conferences we can go to. I mean, there's so many of them. So part of it's get involved in the community, get involved in the forums will be one. Secondly, if you're interested in security from like a blue teaming or red teaming or purple teaming, come and do some of the bug bounties, come and do some of the capture the flags. There are competitions all over the place. Just search for capture the flag competitions. A lot of conferences have them, but also there are separate ones. There are school ones, there are community ones. So get involved in those. Thirdly, publish. It's not quite as bad as academia, where you have publish or perish, but it's not far off of it in some ways. I'm very, very active on LinkedIn, as are a lot of people in the community. So publish your ideas, publish your thoughts, go do some research. Find something that you want to research and just do it. Go down to Best Buy, go out to Fry's and buy a piece of technology and take it to pieces. Download some software and just dig into it and just help people understand, why did you choose this? What could they learn from it? What can you learn from it? And so those are a couple of areas. The get involved is a big one, and also the other reason for things like LinkedIn and Twitter and various other ones is the networking, which is core. One of the biggest challenges in security is getting that first job. You're fresh out of university or fresh out of school, you don't know anybody, and you are knocking on the same door as potentially dozens or hundreds of other people. Something like LinkedIn, where you connect to people and you can find the company. Maybe I'm working at the company. Maybe I've got a friend who is working there. Maybe I know somebody who's working there. And you can knock on my door and go, hey, Chris, so-and-so, do you know anybody at this company, and that way I can connect. That does two things. One, what that means is you've kind of bypassed some of the initial HR filter. We, again, in security need to work with human resources better, because they'll be like, oh, we need an entry-level analyst with 5 years of experience. And we're like, oh, you idiots. And so then there's an education thing. And that's where a lot of us, the connections that you make as you come back into the environment, help a ton. Because even if you don't have 5 years of experience, you can say, hey, I was at DEF CON and I did this. I've listened and I've talked at B-Sides. I've got a LinkedIn profile. Here are all the things I've done. I've done my own research. I researched how to hack headphones using a microwave oven through somebody's Alexa. And you can show this, and you can show how you're part of the community. You can show how you're helping. And so things like that go a long, long way. And again, especially if you do it in such a way where you've got that direct connection to somebody inside the company. I think also find out, so security these days is so broad. You've got everything from, the penetration testing and the assessment side. You've got the blue team side that goes next to that. You have the purple, you have development of security. You have product support. You've got all these different slices of security. I mean, there's so many different areas. Find out where your passion is. Find out if you like policies, procedures, and control. We need a ton of help in governance, like a ton of help. None of us like paperwork that much. Find out if you like forensics. If you like doing crazy puzzles, go check out forensics. If you like breaking into shit, that's cool, but that's easy. Figure out how to fix it. Figure out how to find me inside your environment. So things like that are huge. So really take some time, take a step back and go, what is going to make me happy in this world? I mean, I've been messing around with computers for literally 40 years now, plus a couple of years. I took a break in the middle to go jump out of airplanes for the British military and a few other things and the British government. And then I've been back into it. So I found something that I enjoy. I love the research. I've had so much fun doing the penetration testing and the social engineering. I mean, you've got Chris Nickerson coming up at some point in time. He is by far and away, between him and Chris Hagnady, those are two of the finest minds in social engineering. I mean, Chloe is amazing as well. But those are the folks to really ask on that one. And so there's so many different avenues that you can make a living off of. It's just finding which ones help small to medium businesses. Oh, actually, that reminds me. Go volunteer. Go to the old people's homes. Go volunteer. Go spread awareness. Go teach old people why the heck they should put a passcode on here. Go teach old people why they shouldn't click all of the emails. Go to the small business and go, hey, I want to help you. I'll do it for cost or I'll do it for trade. I'll exchange. You bake bread. I love your bread. How about I help you secure your point of sale systems? I still do that now. I trade. I love bartering. So for me, that's a great way to get experience because you help them out. Go to the library and go, hey, I'd love to help you. And do it in a productive way. Don't go to them and go, hey, I just found all of your problems and I'm going to hold you for ransom unless I can help you. Yeah, schmack, not a good idea. So there's so many different ways that you can get involved for free, working with people and all these other things.
There is one of the researchers, Vic Parati, in our program is working with the Jewish Center downtown Rochester.
Totally. Yeah.
And exactly what he's doing is bringing in researchers or students to help them learn about, right, what is a password, how to use it, how to, not click on this or that. And just great results with that. And so, exactly what you're talking about. Perfect opportunity.
Yeah. Well, it's so a perfect example. There's a number of, so actually, you know, Innocent Lives Foundation, Chris will
Yes.
talk a little bit, make
Yep.
sure that Chris talks a little bit about
Yep.
that.
Yep.
They do look
We
for
will.
volunteers. You have to know open source intelligence, or know at least how to do it, to do some work on that. And you've got to have a pretty strong stomach as well. But also Hackers for Charities. I mean, we have so much work that we do. We go into charities because, you know, they collect money. I'd like that they kept that money and that they don't lose it to anybody who's trying to break into them. So go volunteer. We do a lot of work here with the Denver Rescue Mission. It's one of the biggest charities in Colorado. So we'll go down and we'll help. We set up their networks. We help with their computing systems. When they want to select a vendor, we get involved. We act as their advocate for them so that the vendor doesn't do anything bullshit to them. And we know the pricing and all these other things. So there's a ton that you can do to help on that one.
Great point.
Yeah, there's so much. And there's, you know, hit us up on LinkedIn. Chris and I have done a bunch of posts over the time about getting people into this industry. Chloe has done a ton as well. Chloe Michelson has done a ton. There's a lot of people that have done a lot to try to get more people into this industry. So Google is a good one there, definitely. All right, hopefully that helps Sonia a little bit on that one. All right, let's have a look. What does the future of cyber threat detection and response look like? Ooh, that's an interesting one. Well, let's start with let's baseline. Almost every single company, if they're doing their job properly, has got too many alerts to look at. There's just so much data coming in that you can't make a good decision with everything that you have. So I think there's two things. One of them is where what we call narrow AI. So let's not get confused about what artificial intelligence is and what the marketing people tell you it is. It's called narrow AI, which is a very, very specific genre. It's basically machine learning, but with a few extra bits. So there's something inside narrow AI, which is what's known as, it's SOAR. So security, orchestration, automation, whatever the hell it is. The logic is inside event log monitoring systems. It's like an automated first set of eyes. The idea being is you get all these alerts come in, and what it tries to do is correlate the alert from like an endpoint system to a firewall to an email system, and makes sense of as much of that as it can, and then only really tells you about the important stuff. That's still in its infancy. It's getting there. It's got a lot of work to go. There's definitely a future there, because the idea is, as humans, we can't process fast enough to understand everything that we see. So we have to rely on automation. The second one, for those of you that know my background, is deception technology. So do a little bit of research in deception technology and look at basically how it now is much more effective at camouflaging inside an environment. It's basically like building a minefield inside your environment on everything from users to identities to printers to scanners to computers to all sorts of breadcrumbs that you can put inside an environment that an attacker is likely to trip over, trigger an alert, at which point that obviously goes to the top of the pile. So there's a lot of work on detection and deception that has to be done. There's some work being done on tactics. So a company watches what the attackers are doing over here, and then can take those tactics and those they call them playbooks, TTPs, tactical playbooks. They'll take the idea and then they'll go, would that work in your environment? And if it would, what can you do to secure yourself more effectively? So, but that's a longer term thing, and that really is for more sophisticated companies. But I think there's a lot to do on the detection and deception space, and a lot of it's going to be, I mean, there's a ton of alert fatigue, like a crazy amount of alert fatigue. We've done it. We've worked in companies where we've gone in, we've broken in, we've sat there, we've watched, we've waited, and they hadn't found us. So we started making a bit more noise, and then we made a bit more noise, and then we made a bit more, and eventually, oh yeah, well, eventually we ran Angry IP Scanner. So for those of you that know your tools, Angry IP Scanner, it's like sitting in the Library of Congress, with a megaphone going, I'm here. And unfortunately, the third-party company that was monitoring it said, oh, it's a misconfigured network card, no worries. And we're like, oh. So there's a lot of work to be done. But I think there's a lot that's happening. Again, it's very, very narrow. They call it narrow AI. And it's a very, very specific field. And I think that's actually going to help a lot. So hopefully that answers a little bit of that one. All right, I'm going to hit Chris's, which is or Christopher or Chris. I apologize if I'm also a Chris, but I'm a Christopher. All right, he says, I want to get a job in ethical hacking, red teaming. No, you don't. No, you don't at all. Don't do it. You do not want to dress up in red spandex and jump over tall buildings. None of us look good in red spandex. How do I get past the stigma that a hacker has? Most people don't have a great idea of hackers. I find myself being drawn to hacking to help people fix problems. Welcome to my world. You should join a group. There's a number of us in it. It's called Hacking is Not a Crime. There's quite a few of us in it. It's on Twitter, and we have a Slack channel. If I might suggest, red teaming is eventually going to go away. Let's be perfectly honest. Let me rephrase that. Chris Nickerson runs Laras, which is probably one of the premium red teaming companies out there, like one of the best. Outside of some of the government functions, it's probably got the best hacking team out there, without a shadow of a doubt.
Or none.
That kind of red teaming will stay, because we need the specialists. Absolutely, we have to have the specialists. And Chris and the crew, and there's a few others out there, most of them tied up inside agencies, or some of us get to sit outside the agency, but we then get to go work for the agency sometimes, which means when I get arrested, I don't get yelled at. It's way more fun. So that specialist will be needed, but the general pen testing, red teamy stuff, you'll see a change in the next probably 5 to 10 years, I would argue, where that becomes much more automated, it becomes more crowdsourced, and it becomes simply another function where the average test is done automatically, the report is generated, and you move on. We're seeing more of it now. It's creeping in, and it's really only the specialists that will take over. Now, you will still keep the bug bounties, and you'll still keep like Cobalt IO, which is another one of those crowdsourcing teams, amazing people over there. That's great. But again, I'm really going to encourage you, figure out how to fix the shit you've just broken. I really don't care that you broke something. I don't give a shit these days. If you think about it, there are 26 billion devices on the network today. Who cares if you've broken a few of them? I care if you show me how to fix IoT devices. I care if you break a website using a new exploit, how to fix it. I care if you come up with a 0-day exploit for this. Now you do that, you have an ethical choice. You can take that exploit and you can sell it on the black market and make a few $100,000 at least, depending upon what it is. You can take that exploit and you can sell it to one of the US intelligence, or pick your country. Now you go sell it to the Israelis, go sell it to somebody else's. And you'll still make some good money, but it will never see the light of day, at least until it's outlasted its use. Or you can sell it to Apple and make 20, maybe 50, $100,000. Or you can open source it and tell everybody about it. Your choice, very much your choice. I've trodden every single one of those paths. Happy to talk about that one day. So think about it that way. Again, I don't just want you to break it. I want you to fix it. I want you to show me how you fix it. That's the big one. So anyway, hackers. Yes, I am a hacker, have been all of my life. Our own industry gets confused as to what a hacker is and is not. The media needs somebody to blame. The hacker with the hoodie, with the no face and the gloves on is an easy target. It is what it is. I have threatened and I have tasered people because of it, as have a number of us in our industry. So It is what it is. If I might recommend, if you want to be that hacker, embrace it, wear the t-shirt, and help educate people that the hackers are doing it for the right reasons. The criminals, the adversaries, the attackers are all the ones that are stealing everything. It's an ethical and a moral line. It's always an interesting one. I do a lot of work on chasing down certain types of people. I will break the law to do it. I also have cover from the agencies that I'm working from unofficially, but that's the hacking mentality, and it's a moral thing. I'm doing it for the right reasons, but it's also with the disclosures. I have gotten into trouble at times because people haven't listened, so I've disclosed it publicly. So you're entering an interesting world. If you're a hacker, great, come and join us. Hit the Hacking is Not a Crime scene. There's some amazing folks out there. Woohoo, quantum. Yay, quantum computing. All right. Oh, another one of my favorites. All right. So I know quite a lot about this because I'm involved in some fun things. One of the projects I'm actually involved in is called quantum entanglement. Yeah, it's I can say a little bit. I can't say too much. So what we've done, if you research quantum entanglement, it's basically taking a molecule, or an atom, I should say, splitting it into two, and anything that affects one half immediately affects the other part. Immediately being, it's faster than the speed of light. We've actually figured it out. It's about 10 or more times faster than the speed of light. So now we get into all sorts of interesting science. But the idea is if I can build a communication platform on top of quantum entanglement, then I am not limited by distance, by technology, by weight, by anything else. And some of this is being done for the military and the government. Some of it's being done for space. For every 1 kilogram of things that I send into space, I use 0.9 of a kilogram of fuel to get it up there. So if I don't have to send up a ton of equipment for communication, and all I send up is a little jar of quantum entangled particles, I'm in good shape. So we're building quantum entanglement. So for that aspect, it's fantastic. Now, in terms of security, that's where we get into the whole problem where they're like, oh my gosh, quantum is going to break all the encryption. Well, no, it isn't. Because for every quantum message you break, I can quantumly encrypt another message. So it's another race with another way of doing things. And the actual quantum encryption has now been broken. We've actually managed to demonstrate how we can listen in on secure. There's some crazy stuff. There's some good fun stuff. We did an attack on the Chinese systems that was public, I think about 6 months ago, where we actually broke into the systems that they were using to do quantum encryption, and were able to watch how they encrypted and how they manipulated and watched the particles, and were able to actually manipulate them. So yeah, it's about as secure as everything else on this planet. Everything can be broken. It's just a matter of time.
I mentioned to the students, what is it? For every wall, there is a ladder.
Oh, good, great.
And sometimes it looks like an Apache attack helicopter, that ladder, but that's okay. I was going to mention.
Learned that in 12,000. I did a talk. It's out there on the internet. I did a talk about the history. I went back 12,000 years in our history. We still haven't learned shit from back then.
Right.
Walls don't work.
So I'm seeing, and on the word of quantum, I'm seeing quantum resilient communication systems now. Is that the new buzzword, or?
Oh my gosh, yes. Yeah. It is the new buzzword. I think because there are two main teams that have released like quantum usable engines. So it used to be, up until a couple of years ago, the only people that had quantum engines were the government, Lockheed, and a few other people. Right. Now, IBM will rent you time on their quantum engine for certain types of mathematical and architectural things. So what's happening, to me, It's not quite the new blockchain, but it's not far off of it. I love the idea of a quantum entangled architecture and quantum resilience. I think it's fantastic. But number one, we're at the early days of quantum mathematics, or at least quantum engines. We still have to get over noise algorithms. So if you exceed, I think it's 4 to 6 qubits, somebody would have to double check me. If you exceed 4 to 6 qubits, so basically 4 to 6 pieces of an engine that are doing the math for you, you run into signal to noise errors. The only way of taking those out is by adjusting the algorithm. So the problem then is you're intervening in the quantum process by putting your own overlay on it. Defeats the whole thing. They're talking about coming out with like 20 and 100 qubit engines. And I'm like, the math algorithm to get to that state, its signal to noise ratio is crazy. It's like a radio frequency. Right here, it's perfect. The further out you get, you have to interfere with that signal, which means every single time you interfere with that signal, you're putting your own handprint and signature on it that can be manipulated. The thing I would be worried about more than any of this, any of it, anything at all from a security standpoint, the thing that scares me the most is adversarial machine learning. So an adversarial AI, that scares the crap out of me. Because here's the thing, and we've used it now successfully a number of times in the field. Let's take, I'm not a fan of Darktrace and I'm not a fan of CloudStrike, but let's take CloudStrike as an example. So endpoint detection, it sits there, and think of it in the real world. It's somebody on a door. It's a person on a door with a gun. You either get in or you get shot. Now, that person has a checklist, and that checklist says if you are an American, and if you are over 6 foot tall, and if you are wearing a suit with a blue tie, and you're carrying a briefcase, and you have the right badge, I'm going to let you in. If you don't have all of those things, I'm going to shoot you. Adversarial data, what that does is it changes that list. So now the machine, the person with the gun, goes, well, I'm going to let everybody in who isn't American. I'm going to, oh, you're under 6 foot tall. Yeah, you can, oh, over 6 foot tall, I'm going to shoot you. You're wearing a suit, you get shot. You're wearing a hoodie, you're great. And what it's done is it's trained that engine and trained that system to think differently than it was originally programmed. Because if you think about artificial intelligence and machine learning, it relies upon data to make a decision. It relies upon a massive amount of data to make an effective decision. And the more data it has, in theory, the more effective decision. But the problem is, if I poison that data, and I can get to the data and go, oh no, everybody who's wearing a blue tie, yeah, they're your enemy. Everybody who's wearing a red tie, oh yeah, make them your friends. All of a sudden, that engine's like, well, hang on, I'm not looking over here anymore. I'm now looking over here. And so there is a ton of work. We've done a ton of work. I work with Calypso AI, and we're doing a ton of work with the agencies to look at adversarial learning. It's ridiculously prevalent in the medical field. So if you think about it, if I teach something that the time it can cure somebody is if it goes, they've been teaching this scientific system, hey, the only way to cure somebody is if you go kill these blood cells or you go kill these cells. Now we cure cancer, we cure Alzheimer's. But if I get in there and I teach it that the only way you cure somebody is to kill red blood cells,
that's a problem.
Then we got big problems. Yeah, and then a lot of people are going to cover and die very quickly. So that to me is one of the biggest challenges I think we are facing is we have so much data. The statistics that are relatively well known in the last 2 years, so since 2018 to today, we have manufactured 80 to 90% of the data that we use. So from 2018 all the way back to when we first started messing with computers, 1800s or 1930s or 40s, depends where you want to start. That's only 10 to 20% of the data. Everything else has been created since then. So we're making massive amounts of data, and yet we're not managing it effectively. We're not controlling it effectively. And we really don't always know what we're using to train those engines that are meant to protect us with.
Chris, I want to be respectful of your time. It is a little after 7. I know we said an hour. I just wanted to make sure that we actually have Caleb Barlow at 7:30. He
cool.
is an RIT double major who went on to run IBM's Threat Intel.
Yeah,
but
awesome.
also is the guy that put the cyber talk on the back of a semi and drove it all over the States and stopped in Rochester and then shipped it over to Europe and drove it around there for a while.
That's awesome.
So there's some neat stuff he's going to talk about today, and now running a company that's doing healthcare cybersecurity. So I hope you can stick around for some of that. Actually, I don't know, but I did want to at least mention that to everybody who's here. That at 7:30, Caleb will be joining us as well. So there's another question here. It looks like Chris, and I'm sure my students have some other questions as well. So if you want to get them in.
Chris has been asking a bunch of questions. Kudos to Chris on this stuff, by the way.
So
the rest of you?
I'm going to just interrupt too. Chris is actually going through the Global Cybersecurity Institute's boot camp, cyber boot camp, that a few of the students in this class and myself had built. And he's been one of the students going through it. So we'll talk about that later with Chris when he graduates in a couple of weeks. So thanks for being here tonight, Chris.
Yeah, some awesome questions. Absolutely. And I mean this nicely, but the rest of you take notice. Ask more questions. Seriously. Especially you got some amazing people that are showing up. I mean, huge. Rick has gotten some pretty freaking awesome people together. Yeah, seriously on this one.
Yeah, excited to be a part of this little small gathering.
Oh. So I'm actually want to hit this last question. Not the last question, this question so far. How do we protect people in a world of deep fakes? Let's hit that part of the question first. There are ways to do it. I'm actually working with a stealth company out of Israel at the moment. And ironically, we are using a lot of deep knowledge and a lot of reputation knowledge. So something like deep fakes, a lot of that comes from reputation, and you will never get it 100% certain because there are people that take time to make their deep fakes very effective. But a lot of them have certain what we call tells. So certain signs that implies that all is not quite right. It might be language, it might be photographic evidence, it might be timeline, it might be all sorts of things that we can piece together to go, hey, this is not legitimate. If you combine that by going, I'm not just going to look at one piece of information, I'm going to look at 4 or 5 and see if they corroborate each other or if they contradict each other. So we're doing a lot of work on that. Now, what we're going to do with that is then work out getting it to media channels, to governments, to individuals, and all sorts of people. So that's in the works. For the minute, the only thing that we can do to normal humans is go believe, trust less, validate more. We've always talked about trust and validate. I hate to say it, in this society, it's validate, then trust, and then keep validating. And that's not an easy thing to do. And again, it's something our generation and younger, they get it. Our generation and older, they don't get it. They trust authority. This is one of the biggest problems that we have with scams, is that, somebody will call up the old people's home and will get hold of, Grandpa John, and Grandpa John gets a phone call from the director of the FBI. I need you to be involved in this uber super secret squirrel project. And I need you to be involved, which means you have to be part of this. And, Grandpa John's going to say, yes, the director of the FBI is calling me up. And because the director of the FBI called up and wants John involved in this super secret mission, John's got to go down and buy a whole bunch of gift cards, or John's got to give him the password, or Uncle John's got to do something. And all of a sudden, Uncle John's money's gone. As far as Uncle John's concerned, he was helping the director of the FBI. Most of us, when we run that through our mind, because we've worked and live in a digital world, would tell the director of the FBI to sod off and go jump in a lake. But not everybody thinks that way. So we have to be very, very careful on that one. And that's where we're doing a lot of work. And again, the whole idea is we would also work with the telephony companies, the internet companies, to try and help them understand it more effectively. Biometrics. Let's have the biometric conversation. So the reason we've had passwords for 50 years now, yikes, 50 years, holy shit. The reason we've had passwords for 50 years is because we can change them. So when we lose them or when we forget them, we can change the damn things. We can't change our face. We can't change our fingerprints. We can't change the shape of our skull. We can't change how our heart beats, the irregularities. So there is a problem with using biometrics. Once they're lost, you can't replace them. So a lot of us are working on, we've kind of skipped over biometrics. I hate biometrics. We've skipped over it and we're trying to figure out what to do next. And we're working on a few different things. One of them is a project I've been working on for 5 years or so now, which involves pulling signals out of the brain, EEG signals out of the brain, cross-referencing them with some other things and using that as literally a one-time use password. And you tie it in to the computer or the system you're opening, the two match, and off we go. That's something I'm working on. I'm also, something that I'm actually going to be posting on LinkedIn later on this week is something I'm working with a company called EthoPass, and we're working on some pretty cool technology where, you know, your identity is held by a system that's much more secure. Trusona is another one that I'm tied into, where we're trying to get rid of passwords altogether and use other ways of identifying yourself, you know, your phone and various other things that you have to identify yourself. So a lot of us hate the idea of biometrics. Maybe it's something you can tie into a solution, but it should not be the only solution. For those of you that want to do the research, we've been able to bypass fingerprints and facial validation for how many years? 3, 4, 5 years?
At least.
More years than I care to think of, yeah.
I used to work at Purdue University downstairs from the biometric lab. And Steve Ellison was the British gentleman, you know. So Steve was funny because he was the one missing the fingers.
Yeah.
But he was in this industry and he could never publish because of, they would break everything that was being used. Yeah.
Did you, if you were over at Purdue, did you work or do anything with SPAF or anything?
SPAF was part of my committee for my PhD. Yeah.
You should get SPAF on this.
I would like to.
Get SPAF on this.
Yeah,
hit him up or hit me to hit him up. He's so for those of you that are like, what the hell are you talking
what's
about?
What's a SPAF?
Yeah, what's a SPAF? So there is a gentleman who is at Purdue. He's been a little marginalized now, which actually pisses me off, which is a rather nice, moderate way of putting what I feel. He is one of the grandfathers of this industry. No two ways about it, no arguments, nothing else. Eugene Spafford is basically one of the reasons this industry exists. An amazing, kind gentleman, ridiculous amount of knowledge, like just crazy amount of knowledge, fantastic individual, love him to death. I mean, he basically is the grandfather of this industry, or one of the grandfathers.
History as the Morris worm. I mean, it was him that found him and his team on a bunch of Unix or Univacs, I think at the time.
Yeah, Univac
systems back in the day, found and built their own little quick network to tell everybody about it. But yeah, just a great guy, and would love to have him. I'm thinking actually, so just for everybody who knows, we've done this all male version. We're looking at doing an all female version next. And then we might do a senior version, right?
That would be fantastic.
I know,
yeah,
there's a couple of different ways of twisting this, and I was in another, and I'd love to get him back on, Phil Zimmerman. I was on a panel with Phil at one point.
Yeah.
And he would be
Phil's
interesting
good
to have
people.
as well. So
Yeah,
anyway, just again,
actually,
good stuff
that
here.
that does bring up a good point. We talked about it a little bit about getting into this industry. A word of caution, and it sucks, but I'm going to say it. There are some amazing people in this industry,
Mm.
and there are also some absolute arseholes in this industry. Um, there are enough of us who know who those people are. There are unfortunately people in this industry who will take advantage of you. There are people, unfortunately, who we have called out who will try to groom you for their own purposes. There are some people in this industry who have taken advantage of this industry. It's not perfect, but most of the people in this industry want to see everybody succeed. So back to that, validate, then maybe trust. Please do your best to do a little bit, and talk to us in this industry as well. There's a lot of us here who want to do the right things, who want to bring the next generation or two through. But there's also some idiots, and yeah, there's enough of us here that know them.
So I'm going to just introduce Caleb a little early because he's joined on.
Totally. I'm going to shut the hell up now.
So Chris has been entertaining us and entertaining our questions in chat for the last hour and 15 or more. And Caleb Barlow has joined us. And I will, in a second here, I guess, Caleb, if you're ready, or do you want to wait?
Yeah, sure. How you doing, Chris?
Good. How's it going?
Good, man. I haven't seen you in a while since that thing down at Fort down on the Cape.
Down the Cape. That was fun. Oh my gosh, that was so much fun.
I know it.
We're still doing some stupid things with those folks down there.
So
Yeah,
Caleb, not to jump in too much here, but I did introduce Chris a little bio and what have you. Would you want the same thing before we get into another round of questions?
I don't care. I mean, here's what matters, guys, right? Is that.
That's it.
Everything else, that's just,
right.
you know.
Good on you. Thanks for that. Yeah. No, we've had fun. And this has been just a great evening. And I hope the students are giving me thumbs up or hands up or whatever, as they typically do when I talk to the blank wall here. But no, this has been really just a lot of great questions. And Chris has been saying a lot of wonderful things, inspiring, and also giving everybody some inspiration and hope for the future. And I think even just the future of the rest of our speakers too, as well. So super appreciative of your time tonight, Chris. I know you are obviously super busy and hands everywhere, if you will. But this has been really fun.
Yeah, I appreciate it. Thank you.
I'm not sending you off. You're more than welcome to stay. I know you're busy, but
I might have to dash off, I'm afraid. Yeah, I gotta go cause chaos in the work. Caleb,
great to meet Milo as well.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Huge shout out to both the folks doing the work. Like seriously, much appreciated.
No kidding, right? I always tell them I used to live in a neighborhood full of interpreters, and yeah, it was a neat place. We always, and so I said there's a special place in my heart for these guys because they do work overtime on that.
Totally,
we appreciate it.
Yeah,
thanks,
much appreciated. All right, I will bid everybody farewell. Stay safe, stay healthy. Thank you very much, everybody.
Again, gratefully appreciate it, Chris. Take care. Talk soon.